At 3:17 in the morning, the phone rang in a farmhouse outside Ashford Falls, Oregon. Sarah Carter had slept beside that phone for 15 years. Not because she still expected it to ring, she'd stopped believing that around year 8, but because moving it to another room had always felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. It sat on the nightstand exactly where it had sat since 2006. Cordless, the plastic gone slightly yellow with age, the ringer volume turned all the way up because she'd once missed a call from a telemarketer at 2 a.m. and spent 3 sleepless hours convinced it might have been something else. She was awake before the second ring. She always was. 15 years of a body trained to listen does that to a person. For a few seconds after she said hello, there was nothing. Not static, not the particular silence of a hung-up line, but breathing, careful, deliberate, the sound of someone standing at the edge of a decision they'd already made and were only now finding the nerve to follow through on. Sarah has said in the one interview she's given since that she almost hung up. Almost. But something about the quality of that silence made her wait. Then a man's voice, older, unsteady, thinned by either age or nerves or both, said 8 words. Look where the music stopped. The line went dead before she could ask anything. The caller ID read, blocked. Sarah sat there in the dark, still holding a phone with no one on the other end of it, and did the things she has done at every hour of every day for 15 years without quite noticing she was doing it. She counted. 2 sons, 9 and 7, forever, in the part of her mind that had never let the numbers move forward. She has said that in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting anymore. She felt like something had finally started moving toward her instead of away. She didn't call the sheriff's non-emergency line. She called Detective Marco Reyes directly, on a cell number he'd given her 4 years earlier with the words, "Any hour, I mean that." He picked up on the third ring, already half-dressed by the time she finished the sentence, because in 4 years of inheriting a cold case that predated his career, he had learned that Sarah Carter did not call unless it mattered. He was at her kitchen table by 4:40 a.m., a legal pad in front of him, a coffee neither of them drank going cold between them. He remembers, he told us later, sitting across from a woman who looked less shaken than he'd expected. Not calm, he was careful with that word, but steady, in the specific way of someone who has spent 15 years preparing for exactly this kind of night without knowing it was coming. "Tell me again," he said. "Exactly. Don't clean it up." She told him exactly. He wrote it down exactly, and then he asked her the question that would define the next several months of both their lives. "Sarah, where do you think the music stopped?" She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she has said that hearing someone else take the sentence seriously, turn it over, examine it, refuse to dismiss it as the ramblings of a crank caller at 3 a.m., was the first time in 15 years she felt like the case was still alive to anyone besides her. Before we go further, if you're new here, welcome to Archive 26. We reconstruct cases like this one from records, testimony, and archived footage piece by piece, the way an investigation actually comes together. If you've been with us before, thank you for coming back. If you'd like to see more, consider subscribing. There's more waiting. To understand why 8 words at 3:17 in the morning could undo 15 years of silence, you have to go back to where the silence started. August 12, 2006. A festival in a small park, a choir tuning up for its set, and 2 boys who were there one moment and then were not. Ashford Falls sits in a valley in the western foothills of the Cascades, the kind of town where the volunteer fire department doubles as the softball league, and the woman who runs the diner knows what you're going to order before you sit down. In August 2006, the town's biggest annual event, the Summer Festival, drew nearly its entire population of 900, plus a few hundred more from neighboring communities, into the 6 acres of Riverside Municipal Park. Liam Carter was 9. His brother Owen was 7. Teachers described them, in statements gathered afterward, as a matched set, not close out of obligation, but close because they genuinely preferred each other's company to almost anyone else's. Owen had a habit, Sarah once told a reporter, of narrating his own adventures out loud, and Liam had a habit of pretending not to find it funny while visibly finding it funny. That afternoon, they'd been at the festival since noon. Bounce houses, a dunk tank, a face painting booth that ran out of green paint by 2 o'clock. An event Owen apparently treated as a personal tragedy, and Liam apparently treated as the funniest thing that had happened all summer. At 5:38 p.m., a time we know precisely, because a stage manager's sign-in sheet recovered years later logged it, the community choir began its set on the main stage. Dozens of witness statements gathered afterward confirm what you'd expect. It was the loudest, most attention-holding moment of the entire day. Nearly every adult in the park turned toward the music, at least for a while. Somewhere in that window, a small group of children peeled off toward the park's secondary lot, where a dirt access path ran behind the vendor tents and out toward the tree line. The kind of path kids find instinctively, the way water finds a low point. 2 of those children, ages 8 and 10, later told investigators that Liam and Owen had followed partway down the path with them before turning back. Or so they thought. Neither could say for certain. Neither had been asked, in that moment, to pay attention to 2 other kids in a park full of them. Why would they have been? That was the last credible sighting anyone in Ashford Falls could offer, with any confidence. At 6:35 p.m., Sarah and her husband Daniel began asking around for their sons. First casually, the way parents do at a crowded event, working from the assumption that 2 boys who knew this town and wanted, by every account, to be exactly where they were, had simply drifted somewhere within shouting distance. By 6:55, festival organizers had cut the music and asked everyone to check whether their children were with them. By 7:15, the Willow County Sheriff's Department had a search coordinator on scene. By midnight, the FBI's Portland field office was involved. I want you to sit with that timeline for a moment, because it matters. This wasn't a case where hours passed before anyone noticed. There was no long gap where a family assumed the boys were just playing somewhere. Within 35 minutes of the last sighting, adults were actively searching. Within 2 hours, it was a coordinated operation. And still, nothing. Not a shoe. Not a backpack strap caught on a branch. Not one piece of physical evidence in a wooded area that would be walked by cadaver dogs, searched by divers, and scanned from the air by county helicopters before the week was out. 2 boys who knew this town, knew their own address, and, by every account anyone could offer, wanted to be exactly where they were, vanished during the town's single most attended event of the year. If this were a story about 2 children wandering off, it would have ended within the hour. It didn't. That gap, between what should have happened and what actually did, is where this case has lived for 15 years, and it's where we're going next. A note before we continue. Archive 26 reconstructs cases inspired by real patterns in missing persons investigations. The names, locations, and specific details in the story are fictional, created for entertainment and reflection, though the investigative methods portrayed are grounded in how real cases unfold. Investigators would spend the next 15 years returning to the same 90-minute window, 5:00 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. And every time they returned, the day looked slightly different, depending on who was remembering it. Daniel Carter remembered checking on the boys around 5:15 near the dunk tank, where Owen had just successfully sent a volunteer firefighter into the water and was, in Daniel's words, insufferably proud of himself, the way only a 7-year-old can be about something that took him 4 tries. Sarah remembered a different moment entirely, buying lemonade for the boys closer to 5:30 at a stand near the choir stage, minutes before the performance began. Owen had wanted a second cup. She'd told him no, and he'd negotiated, and she'd said maybe later, and later never came. And she has said, quietly, the one time she's spoken about it publicly, that she has thought about that maybe later more than almost anything else from that day. Neither parent's memory was wrong. They simply belonged to 2 people distracted by 2 different corners of a crowded park, each holding what would become the last clear image of their sons, with no way of knowing it would be the most examined moment of their lives. The witness accounts from that afternoon are, in hindsight, less a mystery than a study in how a crowd remembers, or fails to. Not from dishonesty. From the ordinary fog of 300 children running through a public park on a warm evening, Denise Farrow worked the balloon animal table near the secondary lot that year. In her original 2006 statement, and again when re-interviewed in 2021, she described a man handing out balloons close to where children had been drifting toward the tree path. Older, she guessed, maybe 60s, wearing a cap, though she admitted she'd never gotten a clear look at his face. No official balloon vendor was registered for the festival that year. Deputies in 2006 canvassed the area, found no one matching the description, and eventually noted in the file that Farrow herself had been drinking that afternoon, not heavily but enough that her account was flagged as possible, unconfirmed, and largely set aside. A second witness, a 17-year-old working the concession stand, described seeing 2 boys talking to a couple by a truck near that same lot, but couldn't recall hair color, clothing, or even, with any real certainty, whether the boys matched the Carter brothers at all. He was interviewed for 11 minutes in 2006. He gave a longer, more detailed account in 2021, once investigators had a name and a face to prompt his memory with, a detail we'll come back to, because it raises an uncomfortable question about how memory works under pressure, and how easily it can be shaped by what we're asked rather than what we actually saw. A third account, from a woman named Ruth Okafor, who was watching the choir from a folding lawn chair near the front, placed a boy matching Owen's description near the stage at 6:10, nearly half an hour after the last sighting investigators had settled on as their working timeline. She wasn't certain. She admitted gently that she'd seen a great many children that day, all in roughly the same size and energy, and that memory has a way of filling gaps it has no business filling. None of these accounts agreed with each other. None could be independently confirmed. And that is, more often than people expect, the reality of a public disappearance, not silence, but a wall of well-meaning contradictory noise that makes the truth harder to find, not easier. By nightfall on August 12th, the search had become one of the largest in Willow County's history, and it's worth slowing down here, because search is a word that flattens what actually happens on the ground. At 9:40 p.m., a volunteer named Curtis Beal, a retired forestry worker who had lived in Ashford Falls his whole life and knew the tree line behind the park better than anyone on the search roster, was walking a grid section with a handheld spotlight when his radio crackled with a report from the K9 team 50 yards to his left. He remembers it clearly, he told us, because for about 90 seconds, he let himself believe they'd found something. The dog had alerted on a scent near the service road. Curtis stood in the dark, spotlight trembling slightly in his hand. Not from fear, he was clear about that, but from the specific physical exhaustion of adrenaline that had nowhere to go, and waited. scent trail, tracked carefully by the handler and her dog, ran from the secondary lot toward the service road, and then simply stopped. Not faded gradually the way a trail does when a person walks somewhere and the scent disperses over open ground. Stopped the way a trail does when whatever the dog was following was lifted off the ground entirely. Into a vehicle, most likely. Though in 2006 there was no way to confirm that, and a service road used by dozens of festival vendors that day offered no way to narrow down which of them might matter. Curtis has said he still thinks about those 90 seconds sometimes. The particular kind of hope that rises fast and falls faster, and how it left something behind each time it happened, like a tide pulling sand out with it. Divers searched Willow River at 3 points downstream over the following 2 days, in water cold enough that the search coordinator rotated teams every 40 minutes to prevent hypothermia. Helicopters with thermal imaging sensors, cutting-edge equipment for a county sheriff's department at the time, flew grid patterns over the surrounding timberland until well past 2 a.m. on the first night, and resumed again at first light. Volunteers, some driving in from towns 40 miles away after hearing the news on local radio, walked the tree line shoulder to shoulder for the better part of a week, calling the boys' names into woods that gave nothing back. They found nothing that could be tied to Liam or Owen. Not a scrap of clothing, not a dropped toy. In a search of that scale, that absence became its own kind of evidence, suggesting uncomfortably that whatever had happened to the boys likely hadn't happened in those woods at all. I want to ask you something, because it's a question investigators kept returning to for 15 years, and I don't think there's a comfortable answer. If 2 children are taken from a crowded public event, in daylight, surrounded by hundreds of adults, how does no one see it happen? Not one clear, unshakable sighting out of an entire town. Is that simply bad luck? Or is it something closer to planning? By the end of that first week, the FBI's involvement had scaled the case into a full multi-jurisdictional investigation, but the leads had already begun drying to nothing. No ransom demand ever came, a detail investigators noted early and returned to often because its absence ruled out the most common and, in some ways, most straightforward explanation for a child abduction. No credible sighting emerged in the months that followed, despite a nationwide alert and, eventually, national news coverage that brought reporters to Ashford Falls for the better part of a month before the story, as these stories do, began to fade from the national conversation while never once fading from the town itself. By the following spring, the file had been formally reclassified, active but cold. Detective Frank Doyle, who ran the original 2006 investigation and would carry it unofficially for the rest of his career, once told a local reporter that a cold case doesn't feel cold to the people living inside it. "The file goes in a drawer," he said. "The family doesn't." Daniel and Sarah Carter didn't leave Ashford Falls. They stayed in the same house on the same road with the boys' bedroom left exactly as it was. Bunk beds made, a half-finished model airplane on Liam's desk. Owen's stuffed rabbit propped against the pillow, its ear worn thin from years of being carried everywhere. Daniel passed away in 2014. Of a heart condition his doctor would later tell. Sarah was likely worsened by 15 years, well, 8 years by then, of a stress the body was never built to carry that long. Sarah kept the vigil alone. Every August 12th, she lit 2 candles on the porch and let them burn through the night. She has said she couldn't tell you exactly what she believed the candles would do, only that not lighting them felt like a kind of surrender she wasn't willing to make. There's a part of this case that rarely makes it into the shorter tellings because it doesn't move the investigation forward in any direct way. But it's the part that, in our view, explains everything that came after, because it's where the shape of the next 15 years was set. By December of 2006, 4 months after the disappearance, the search teams had gone home. The news vans had gone home. The volunteers who had walked the tree line in August in shorts and sunburn had returned to their lives, as people do, not out of callousness, but because a search cannot sustain itself indefinitely on hope alone. What remained was a much smaller group, a handful of deputies, a rotating FBI liaison, and a family trying to figure out how to keep living inside a house that had, overnight, become a shrine to a specific afternoon in August. Sarah has described that first winter as the hardest of the entire 15 years, harder even than the anniversary that would eventually arrive without an answer. In August, there had still been momentum, searches, headlines. The sense, however false it eventually proved, that finding them was a matter of when, not if. By December, the momentum was gone, and what replaced it was something she didn't have a word for at the time, and later learned was simply called ambiguous grief. Grief with no confirmed loss to grieve, and therefore no clear permission to begin healing from it. She remembers standing in the boys' room on Christmas Eve, holding 2 wrapped presents she had bought out of a kind of desperate ritual. A set of Legos for Liam, a stuffed dog to keep the worn rabbit company for Owen, unable to decide whether wrapping them made her hopeful or made her something closer to unwell. She wrapped them anyway. She has kept them, unopened, in the closet of that room for 15 years. It was during that winter that the case produced its first false lead of real consequence, the kind that, for a few days, made an entire family believe the waiting might be over. In late January 2007, a tip came into the Willow County line from a gas station attendant 300 miles south, near the California border, who reported 2 boys matching the Carter's description traveling with an adult male, paying cash, agitated. The attendant had seen the initial news coverage months earlier and recognized, or believed he recognized, Liam's face from a flyer he'd kept taped behind the register. Detective Doyle drove through the night to interview him personally. For 18 hours, it was the most promising lead the case had produced. It didn't hold up. The boys in question were, investigators determined through a follow-up with California authorities, 2 brothers of similar age and build traveling with their father during a contentious custody dispute. Frightened, yes, and cash-paying, yes, for reasons that had nothing to do with Ashford Falls. The family was located, interviewed, and cleared within days. Doyle has said, in an interview conducted years later for this reconstruction, that driving home from that dead end was one of the longest drives of his career. Not because the lead had failed. False leads fail constantly in cases like this, but because he was the one who had to call Sarah and tell her. "You learn to be careful with hope in this job," he said. "Not because it isn't real, because it's the only thing some families have left, and every time you have to take a piece of it back, you're taking something you can't ever give back in full, even when you're right the next time." There would be, over the following years, at least 6 more leads considered serious enough to formally investigate. A psychic tip in 2008, logged, assessed, and set aside within a day, in keeping with department policy that treats such tips as any other unverified claim requiring independent corroboration before resources are committed. A 2009 sighting report from a state fair 200 miles east that, on investigation, turned out to be 2 unrelated children. A 2011 claim from a man later found to have a documented history of false confessions in unrelated cases nationwide, whose account collapsed under basic timeline questions within the first interview. And most painfully, a 2013 DNA comparison requested by a family in Nevada, who had, for reasons of their own, come to believe their adopted son might be Liam Carter. The comparison was conclusive and negative within 3 weeks. Sarah has said that of everything the case put her through, that one, a family reaching toward her with real, if misplaced, hope, was among the hardest to absorb, because for 3 weeks she let herself believe it too. None of these leads moved the case forward. All of them moved the family through cycles of hope and loss that, repeated enough times, begin to reshape a person from the inside, the same way water, given enough years, reshapes stone. By 2021, the Carter case existed mostly as a name in a cold case archive, and a fading memory in a town that had, understandably, moved forward around it. New families had settled on Sarah Street over the years. The park had been renovated twice, new play equipment in 2011, a repaved lot in 2018, a lot that, unknowingly, sat directly over the ground where a service road had once run. The choir that performed that August evening had disbanded a decade earlier. Most of its members had scattered to other towns, other lives, carrying with them only a vague memory of a summer evening they hadn't known, at the time, would matter to anyone. Sarah gave almost no interviews after the 5th anniversary. She had learned, painfully, what most families of the missing eventually learn: that public attention is a resource that runs out long before an answer does, and that there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being asked, every year on the same date, to perform a grief that never actually paused long enough to need performing. She kept living, in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who has decided that stopping is not an option, even when hoping has become almost unbearable to sustain. She took a job at the county library in 2012, partly for the income, partly, she has admitted, because being surrounded by people asking small answerable questions all day was easier than being alone with the one question that never got answered. Detective Marco Reyes inherited the file in 2016, 4 years before the call that would reopen it, and by his own account, read through the original case notes more times than he could reasonably justify. Not because he expected to find something Doyle had missed, but because, as he put it, sometimes you read a cold file often enough that you start to notice what isn't there instead of just what is. Then, at 3:17 on a morning in August 2021, 15 years almost to the day, since the last credible sighting, came the call. Look where the music stopped. Reyes didn't dismiss it. Cold case detectives get calls like this. Plenty of them. Usually from people who have watched one too many documentaries about a case and want, for reasons that are more about themselves than the victims, to insert themselves into a story that isn't theirs. But something about this one didn't fit that pattern. The caller hadn't asked for money, hadn't offered a dramatic, self-serving confession. He'd said one sentence and hung up. The behavior, Reyes noted in his log that morning, of someone compelled to say something and equally afraid of saying too much. The phone company's modern trace came back inconclusive at first. The call had been routed through a masking service, the kind increasingly common and increasingly frustrating for investigators working calls like this. But a communications engineer working with the sheriff's department, a woman named Priya Nair, who had joined the department's small digital forensics unit 2 years earlier, noticed something in the routing data that almost got overlooked. A brief handoff through an older regional exchange, a legacy telephone switch still used by a small number of rural cooperatives and agricultural businesses scattered through the county. Most calls hadn't touched that particular exchange in years. It survived mostly because replacing it wasn't worth the cost to the handful of businesses still wired through it. Nair remembers staring at the routing log for a long time before she was sure of what she was looking at. "It's not a smoking gun," she told Reyes when she brought it to him. "It's a smoke trail, but it's a real one." It wasn't proof of a specific location, but it narrowed the likely origin of the call to a cluster of communities within about 30 miles of Ashford Falls, the same general area the case had always centered on, and in 15 years never actually left. That alone wouldn't have reopened anything. What happened 2 weeks later did. As part of the renewed review, Reyes ordered a full recatalog of every piece of physical media ever connected to the 2006 festival. Camcorder tapes, disposable camera prints, local newspaper negatives, anything logged as evidence or donated by residents over the years for a community memory project the town's historical society had run at the time. Most of it had already been examined in 2006 and had yielded nothing, but one item stood out in the catalog. A mini-DV tape recovered from a local resident named Tom Hallery, who had been filming the festival that year as one of several volunteers documenting the town's events for the Historical Society's archive. We spoke with Tom for this reconstruction. He still lives in Ashford Falls, still has the camcorder, though it doesn't work anymore. He remembers handing the original tape over in 2006 without much thought. He'd filmed maybe 40 minutes of footage, mostly the choir and the food stands, nothing he imagined mattering to an investigation. He remembers, too, the specific discomfort of being asked for it a second time, 15 years later. They told me the first version had corrupted sections, he said. Dropout, they called it. Spots where the tape just wouldn't play. I figured that was that. I didn't think about it again for 15 years. And then a detective's calling me asking if I still have the original cassette. Not a copy, the original. Because apparently now they can do things with it they couldn't do back then. He still had it. It had been sitting, unlabeled, in a shoebox in his garage since 2007. Modern forensic video restoration is considerably more capable than what existed in 2006. Frame-by-frame reconstruction techniques that can recover data from magnetic degradation that would once have simply been unreadable. A specialist working with the FBI's reopened file spent 11 days processing the tape and was able to recover several additional seconds of usable footage from sections previously written off as unrecoverable. It didn't show the boys, but in the background of one recovered clip, timestamped 5:41 p.m., 3 minutes after the choir began, a vehicle was visible, parked in a section of the secondary lot that had been cordoned off to the public for vendor use only. No permit record from 2006 listed a vehicle authorized to be in that space at that time. No prior witness statement, no piece of the original 2006 file had ever mentioned it. 15 years of investigation, and this was the first entirely new piece of physical evidence the case had ever produced. Reyes has said that watching that clip for the first time, grainy, partial, the vehicle itself little more than a dark shape and a suggestion of a bumper, was the closest he's come in his career to feeling a case shift underneath him in real time. You spend years reading a file where everything already happened, he said. And then, for about 4 seconds, you're watching something happen that nobody's ever seen before. It doesn't feel like progress at first. It feels like the ground moving. It changed the direction of the investigation completely, from searching for what might have happened to the boys in the woods, to asking a much narrower, much more answerable question. Who had access to that restricted lot? And why, in 15 years, had no one ever mentioned that car? The restricted lot had been reserved according to the original 2006 festival planning documents, recovered from the town's archive, still boxed and largely untouched since the year they were filed, for event staff and a short list of approved vendors. Reyes pulled the full roster. Food vendors, the company that supplied the bounce houses, the sound and stage crew, and, critically, the volunteer coordination team, a group of roughly a dozen residents who had organized the children's activities that year, including the balloon table, the face painting booth, and the dunk tank. Cross-referencing vendor permits, staff sign-in sheets, and newspaper photographs from the festival, including several printed in the Willow County Courier, that had never made it into the official case file, dug out of a newspaper archive by a local reporter named Elena Ruiz, who had covered the case as a junior staffer in 2006 and had never fully let it go, Investigators built for the first time a near-complete picture of who had legitimate reason to be near that lot that afternoon. Elena's involvement in 2021 deserves its own mention. She had been 24 in 2006, 3 months into her first newspaper job, assigned to cover what should have been a routine festival write-up, and instead found herself covering the biggest story of her career on her 4th month of employment. She kept every notebook, every contact sheet of undeveloped photographs the paper hadn't used. When Reyes reached out in 2021, asking whether the Courier's archive extended back to 2006 in a form more complete than what had been microfilmed, she didn't just point him to the archive. She spent 3 unpaid weekends going through her own boxes first. "I always felt like I missed something," she told us. "Every reporter who covers a story like that carries a version of that feeling. You write what you can confirm, and you go home. And some small part of you keeps turning over the things you couldn't confirm, for years, whether you want it to or not." One of her contact sheets, photographs taken but never published, considered at the time too tangential to the festival's main events, showed a wide shot of the secondary lot at what the sheet's handwritten timestamp indicated was roughly 5:40 p.m. In the corner of the frame, barely in focus, stood 2 adults beside a parked vehicle. Not clear enough to identify. Clear enough, cross-referenced against the restored video, to confirm that a car had genuinely been present in that lot at that time. And that photograph existed only because a 24-year-old reporter, 15 years earlier, had taken one extra frame she'd never had a reason to develop. 2 names, drawn from the volunteer coordination roster, stood out to investigators for a simple reason. They weren't in Ashford Falls anymore, and hadn't been for 15 years. Raymond and Doris Whitfield had lived in Ashford Falls for 6 years before the 2006 festival. Active in the Volunteer Coordination Committee, well-liked by most accounts, and, according to several neighbors interviewed at the time and again in 2021, quiet about their personal life in a way people had noticed without ever quite remarking on. They had no children of their own. County family court records, pulled as part of the renewed investigation, showed they had pursued and been declined formal adoption twice in the years prior. Once cited as related to Raymond's employment instability, and once flagging a decades-old incident involving Doris that had never resulted in charges but had surfaced during a home study review and been enough on its own to end the application. The Whitfields left Ashford Falls in October 2006, 2 months after the disappearance, citing a job opportunity in another state. At the time, nothing connected them to the case. Their names appeared nowhere in the 2006 witness statements. They simply moved, the way people in a small town sometimes do without much notice, and were gradually, unremarkably forgotten. The kind of quiet departure that, in a town of 900, usually means nothing at all, and in this case meant everything. What reopened interest in them wasn't the restored footage alone. It was too degraded to confirm a license plate, a detail that frustrated investigators for weeks before a different piece of the case moved things forward instead. It was something a re-interviewed volunteer mentioned, almost in passing, 15 years after the fact. Margaret Ellery had worked the sign-in table for festival volunteers in 2006. In her original statement, she'd said nothing unusual. Nothing at the time seemed worth mentioning. In 2021, re-interviewed as part of the reopened case, sitting across from Reyes at her kitchen table with the specific unease of someone worried she's about to matter more than she wants to, she recalled something she hadn't thought worth including 15 years earlier. "It was so short," she said. "The sound cut out. The whole stage went quiet for a second, and some of the lights near the back went dark, and then it just came back on, like nothing happened. Nobody made a big deal of it. I only remember it at all because I was worried it would ruin the performance, and then it didn't, so I forgot about it within the hour. An electrician's log from the equipment rental company that supplied the festival's stage, recovered after some difficulty from a storage unit belonging to the now defunct company, tracked down through a former employee, Elena Ruiz, managed to locate through an old business directory, confirmed a brief power interruption at 5:43 p.m., lasting roughly 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which the stage lighting dimmed, the sound briefly cut, and, as several witnesses would now recall, one specifically and carefully asked, attention across that section of the park, scattered in a dozen small directions at once. It was a minor, unremarkable technical failure, but it created exactly the kind of brief, chaotic window in which two children could be moved from one point to another without a single clean line of sight from anyone in a crowd of hundreds. This is the moment I find myself returning to most in this whole case. Not a grand conspiracy, not an elaborate plan requiring dozens of moving parts, just an ordinary equipment failure, 4 minutes long, that happened to align, whether by chance or by design, and investigators genuinely don't know which, with the only gap in public attention wide enough to matter. What would you have needed to notice, standing in that crowd, to catch something wrong in those 4 minutes? And is it fair, honestly, to expect anyone to have? Investigators located Doris Whitfield first, deceased in 2015 in a town roughly 340 miles away, under her married name, no further complications in the record. Raymond Whitfield had died just 8 months before the 2021 call, according to public records pulled within days of the Whitfield name surfacing, which meant that whoever had called Sarah Carter's house at 3:17 in the morning was not Raymond. It was someone who knew what Raymond had done and had waited until after his death to say anything at all. The man investigators eventually identified was Raymond Whitfield's younger brother, Walter, 78 years old, living alone in a small house roughly 22 miles from Ashford Falls. Well, within the radius the phone exchange trace had suggested from the very beginning of the renewed investigation. Reyes and a second detective drove out to see him on a Tuesday morning in October 2021. Walter answered the door already dressed, already, in some sense, waiting. The way people wait when they've spent months rehearsing a conversation they know is eventually coming and have simply run out of ways to postpone it. He did not deny the call. What he gave investigators, across several difficult interviews over the following weeks, was not a confession delivered cleanly all at once, but something closer to a slow unburdening. A man in his late 70s working, sentence by sentence, through 15 years of a silence he had built for reasons that had made a kind of sense to him once, and had stopped making sense somewhere along the way, without him quite noticing the shift. He had not been part of the 2006 festival. He hadn't lived in Ashford Falls at all. What he had done, in the weeks following the disappearance, was help his brother and sister-in-law relocate 2 boys into what he had been told, and had chosen at the time to believe, was a legitimate private guardianship arrangement for children whose parents could no longer care for them. He drove one leg of the journey himself, he told investigators. A rented van, a route that deliberately avoided interstate highways. He said Raymond had told him the paperwork would be finalized within the month. I asked him once, Walter told Reyes, in an interview later summarized in court filings. I asked him where the paperwork was. He said it was being handled. I wanted to believe him. It was easier than the alternative. He said he didn't ask enough questions after that, not because he never wondered, but because by the time the wondering became something closer to certainty, months had passed, and the boys were already settled, already beginning, in the specific and merciless way of young children, to adjust to a new life simply because it was the one in front of them. He told himself, he said, that undoing it at that point would only hurt them further. He carried that justification for a decade and a half, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone worn smooth from handling, less because it still convinced him and more because he no longer knew how to put it down. Reyes asked him directly in the third interview, why now? Because Raymond's the one who has to answer to something for what he did. Walter said, not me. I told myself that for 15 years. And then he died. And I understood. Nobody was ever going to make him answer for anything. I was the only one left who could. He never gave the boys current names or exact location outright, even across weeks of interviews, whether from residual protectiveness, fear of his own legal exposure, or something closer to an old man's difficulty finally saying a thing he'd spent 15 years training himself not to say. Investigators couldn't be entirely certain, and Walter himself, when asked, didn't fully seem to know either. What he gave them, piece by piece, was enough. Banking records tied to a private guardianship arrangement processed through a small, loosely regulated intermediary in a neighboring state. A name change filed in a county 2 states away. And ultimately, enough specific detail for investigators to identify 2 men, now 24 and 22, living under the surname of an adoptive family in a town in Idaho, unaware that the story they had been told about their own origins, that their birth parents had died in an accident when they were small, was not true. DNA comparison confirmed it within 3 weeks. Both men were Liam and Owen Carter. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the case that resists the neat shape a story usually wants to take. Both men had been raised, by every account investigators gathered, in a stable home. Not a hidden one, not a secretive one, but an ordinary house in an ordinary Idaho town, by people who appeared to have genuinely believed the account they'd been given by the intermediary, who facilitated the placement and who had raised the boys, whatever the legality of how they'd come to have them, with what looked, by every outward measure, like real love. The adoptive parents themselves, interviewed separately, and, according to investigators, visibly shaken by what they learned, insisted they had believed they were providing a home for 2 children whose birth family could no longer care for them, and had no reason at the time to doubt the paperwork they'd been given. Learning the truth meant confronting not just a 15-year absence, but an entire identity built on a fabrication neither man had chosen and neither had any reason to question. The older brother, we're withholding the name he currently goes by, at his family's request, reportedly sat in silence for several minutes after Reyes first laid out what the DNA results confirmed, and then asked a single question, whether his birth mother was still alive. The younger brother, according to people close to the investigation, asked to see a photograph before he'd agreed to believe any of it. Sarah met her sons for the first time in 15 years in a supervised setting arranged through victim services, nearly 4 months after the phone call that started it all. She has said, in the only interview she's given since, that she spent those 4 months trying to prepare herself, and eventually understood there was no way to prepare for it. That 15 years of imagining a reunion had built, without her fully realizing it, a version of the moment that had nothing to do with the 2 grown men who actually walked into that room. I didn't recognize them, she said. I want to say that clearly because I think people expect a mother to just know, the way it happens in movies. I didn't. I saw 2 men. And somewhere underneath that, if I looked hard enough, I could find pieces. Owen's laugh, when he finally laughed at something, was exactly the same laugh, 15 years later, in a much deeper voice. Liam still tilts his head the same way when he's trying to figure out if he trusts you. But it wasn't recognition. It was closer to excavation. Digging until I found something I remembered underneath someone I didn't. She has said without hesitation that it wasn't closure, not in the way she'd once imagined the word. It felt, she said, like meeting someone your child grew into without you. What she did say clearly was that it was the first time in 15 years she had stopped waiting for the phone to ring, because whatever this was, complicated, unfinished, still being built one careful conversation at a time, it was no longer nothing. It was no longer a question with no answer attached to it. The relationship that has followed, according to people close to the family, has been slow and deliberately unhurried. Regular calls, one supervised visit becoming, over months, a handful of unsupervised ones. No attempt on anyone's part to compress 15 years into a single afternoon. Both men, we understand, have chosen to maintain relationships with the adoptive family that raised them, a decision Sarah has said she not only understands but respects. They didn't do anything wrong, she said of the adoptive parents. They loved two boys who needed somewhere to be loved. I can be angry about how that happened and still know that's true. Walter Whitfield was charged in connection with the case. Legal proceedings at the time of this account remain ongoing. Doris and Raymond Whitfield, both deceased, were never able to answer for what investigators believe was a private, informal placement, facilitated, they now suspect, by a small, loosely regulated network operating on the margins of the child welfare system, exploiting families desperate enough or unscrupulous enough not to ask too closely where a child had come from. Reyes has said the department is continuing to investigate whether the intermediary involved in the Whitfield placement facilitated other similar arrangements, a thread that, as of this account, remains open. Detective Frank Doyle, long retired, was among the first people Reyes called once the DNA results came back. Doyle has said, in the interview conducted for this reconstruction, that he'd made peace years earlier with the idea that he would die without knowing what happened to the Carter boys, and that being wrong about that, at 71 years old, was one of the strangest reliefs of his life. You carry a case like that, he said, even after you retire, even after someone else's name is on the file. Some part of you never stops working it quietly, in the back of your mind, for the rest of your life. Getting to be wrong about how it ends, that's not something I ever expected to feel. It is, in the end, a human story rather than a mysterious one. No conspiracy of great size or sophistication. No single evil mastermind pulling strings across 15 years. Just a handful of people who made a choice in a chaotic 4-minute window on an August afternoon, and then spent a decade and a half deciding, one silence at a time, not to undo it, until one of them, running out of time and out of reasons to keep protecting a brother who could no longer be protected from anything, finally didn't. What do you think finally made Walter pick up the phone? Guilt outliving the person he was protecting, or something closer to needing, before his own time ran out, to give someone else the chance he never gave himself, the chance to stop carrying it alone? This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real patterns found in missing persons investigations. The long silences, the imperfect memories, the small mechanical failures that can change everything, and the families who keep a light on regardless of how many years pass. It was created for entertainment and reflection, and while the case, the people, and the town of Ashford Falls are not real, the kind of quiet human courage it takes to finally tell the truth, that part we think is. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this case moved you, we'd genuinely like to know what you think really happened in those 4 minutes, and what you think it would take to make someone wait 15 years to say 8 words. Let us know in the comments. If you'd like to see more cases reconstructed like this one, consider liking this video and subscribing to Archive 26 for more. We'll see you in the next case.